I went for a period where I just couldn't stand myself. I just thought I was an awful person. I just thought I'd, essentially killed my brother.
If you have a condition that is unseen, it's so challenging, to communicate that, to kind of actually say this is legitimate.
Grief's like a fingerprint. Everyone's is different, honestly. Yeah. The more I talk to people about it, the more I realise how individual it is.
The best bit of advice I ever got was, it was just after Mum had died, and you'll never get over this moment, but you will learn to live with it. Welcome to Digital Health Diagnosed, your dose of tech wellbeing, hosted by me, Dr. Rachael Kent, lecturer in digital economy and society at King's College London and founder of Dr. Digital Health. This podcast is here to help you diagnose how technology impacts your health. We provide you with evidence-based research and tips and strategies to live better with our technology in everyday life. Today, I am so excited to be joined by an incredible activist in the mental health space, raising awareness of such challenging topics and destigmatizing those. Ben West, thank you so much for being here. You're a fantastic campaigner. You've made a huge impact already in, the short time that you have been campaigning for mental health based upon your own tragic experiences. You've written this incredible book, which I'm a huge fan of. So I just want to thank you so much for taking the time and being here with us
Thank you
today.
for having me. It's really good. I've had a really busy day, and I was just saying to you, it's nice just to sit down. Yeah. And even though it's a tough conversation, it is nice, especially in our fast-paced world that we both work in, to actually sit down and sort of have quite an in-depth conversation about something. So thank you for having me.
Brilliant. All right. Thank you so much. I'm so excited for the conversation we're going to have. We've got about an hour, so we can kind of just go for it and see how much we can get through. So I guess the one thing I do want to say before we get into the conversation is a bit of a trigger warning. So some of the topics we're going to be discussing today will cover things like death, grief, suicide, and some mental illnesses like depression. So for anybody that's not perhaps feeling that they have capacity right this moment to hear that, just switch off. But I just want to let everybody know that we are going to be covering some really big and important topics, but ones that are also very triggering as well. Okay, so my first question then, Ben, is just going to get straight into it.
Yeah.
Of course, you've experienced a huge amount of trauma and tragedy of losing your brother Sam to suicide. And this has driven and motivated you to talk so excessively and so captivatingly about mental health. Can you just explain for our listeners the feeling that has propelled you, those initial motivations to speak out and raise awareness? Because not everybody would have had that capacity, understandably, but you have. And I would just love to kind of start at that place for you.
Such a great question, because there's so many things that went into this. So for some context, I was still at school when Sam died. Sam was 15, I was 17. He was just about to sit his GCSEs. I was just about to sit my A-levels. And so, I'd never heard anything about mental health before. No one had ever talked to me about mental health. Depression was something that I'd never come across before until Sam was diagnosed with it. And then Sam died, and the school said, "Oh, wouldn't it be great to do a memorial assembly for the whole school to give everyone closure?" And they went, "Ben, you'd love to do that, wouldn't you?" And
host that
and so
space.
It was like, lots of people came up and said their bit, but they sort of put me on the stage and went, "Wow, school's yours." And I sort of used it as an opportunity to basically talk about what I was feeling. Like, this illness that I didn't really know much about had taken my brother. I knew that he was ashamed of being diagnosed through conversations I'd had with my mum and him. I knew there was a huge amount of stigma that he faced around that. So I just used this opportunity to sort of stand on stage, be like, it's really sad, there's lots I regret, but this mental illness thing, we've got to talk about it more, and we need to make it a conversation in school and in our communities. And it was amazing because for the sort of weeks leading up to that assembly, all the messages I was getting were the classic, "Let me know if you need anything, sorry to hear what's happened, I hope you're okay, blah blah blah." And then honestly, the minute I walked out of that assembly, every single message became, "I'm really not doing well, I'm really struggling.
Wow.
I've been diagnosed with anorexia, I've been diagnosed with depression, I've self-harmed for years. I had friends that I'd known most of my life that told me that they'd attempted suicide before and never told anyone."
Wow.
And I just, honestly, it got to a point where I started to see everyone around me and go, almost everyone I know has something secret they're keeping, and it was terrifying. I was absolutely terrified. And I remember having a quite an emotional conversation with a friend of mine, and just repeating. I was sobbing and crying, and I just kept repeating, like, I can't do it again, I can't do it again. And there genuinely was that moment, like a real fear that this was just going to keep happening, and obviously driven by trauma and your body just completely, being terrified of the same experience happening again. It was really awful. And then, so that was one of the reasons why I started to go, we need to do more here, and there's a lot of people that need to have conversations with their friends, because actually I realized that two friends in the same friend group were dealing with exactly the same thing, and neither of them knew that they were sharing that experience. So that was one of the big drivers, was actually just creating a conversation for these people, and sort of out of fear that it would happen again. But actually, a huge driver for this for me was guilt, and this is something that people talk about a lot with grief in general, but with suicide it's a completely different beast. The guilt that you can face is just enormous. And so for me, like, I was 17, Sam was 15. I had another brother, Tom, who was younger. 3 boys growing up. We had arguments a lot.
No doubt.
And now in a healthy mindset, I can look at that and be like, yeah, we argued a lot growing up. It was a love-hate relationship. But in the time when Sam died, I was his older brother, and I, had this happen. And my brain just went into, I'm his older brother. He didn't feel like he could go to me. I clearly didn't love him enough, blah, 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 guilt, shame, the spiral. It just got awful. And I went for a period where I just couldn't stand myself. I just thought I was an awful person. I just thought I'd, essentially killed my brother. I had done all this stuff, and suddenly I was just like, I almost need to prove to the world that I can do something good. And
because of that kind of really negative internal narrative that you were telling yourself.
Exactly. So this constant negativity and this constant feeling of like, I owe something. I owe something good to go out after this. And so, there was a real feeling in me of like, if I can try and do something good, then I can sort of right a wrong in a weird way. But obviously it's developed into so much more. And just to say, and to sort of caveat all of that, like, I've gone through so much treatment and help, and I've talked about this for so many years. I understand now, and this is one of the messages I want to get to people is like, there was no reason for me to have felt that shame or guilt to that level. I was not a bad person for having arguments with Sam. Actually, I'd be a bit of a strange person if I hadn't had arguments with Sam. Right, exactly. So yeah, those are the two real driving reasons. And obviously, as things have developed, I've just realized that I really have a position here where I can try and help, and that's what I'll try and do. And that's what Sam wanted. He really struggled with the stigma and the shame, and if I can try and just normalize it a little bit by just talking about it in quite a normal way, then
absolutely,
then that's hopefully trickles down and creates the ripples.
I think it's happening slowly but surely. It's really interesting to hear you reflect on your own feelings of guilt. I think that's a very common kind of default feeling that those around those who whose lives have been lost to suicide feel that they should have done something more. And then I think as a grief response to then want to be proactive and feel like, in a way, there's an element of kind of helping yourself through that process of trauma, as well as helping, of course, those around you. And I guess there's a kind of 2 parts to it that is really, really important. But I think coming back to the guilt thing, I think it's something that is so embedded in our conversations and the stigmas that we have around mental health and mental illness and depression in particular. And I want to just touch on your childhood in this, because in the book you write so brilliantly and candidly about your childhood and how it was a happy childhood. And the point I'm assuming you're trying to make here is that not everybody who has a mental illness or has depression or has whatever type of struggles that we all face at some stage in our life, to a greater or a lesser degree, comes from a background that might have necessarily kind of directly correlated to that, or we would assume correlated to that. that. So like a traumatic childhood or neglect
Mm.
or abandonment or whatever we kind of might try and create those causal links. I think we as a society, particularly in Western society, try and get to a reason of the why a lot.
Mm.
And what I really like in your book, Ben, is that you say, actually, it's okay for there not to be a reason for this. This just happens. This is an illness like breaking an ankle. It's the same thing. It just means that your brain works differently, and we need to have a kind of a greater understanding of that.
Mm.
And I suppose what I'd love to know today is, when we're talking about trauma and also talking about mental illness and depression, what do you think are some of the key stigmas, the most problematic stigmas, because there are many, that surround mental illness and particular depression today?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we've just sort of touched upon one there, which is this whole idea that everything has to have a reason. And that's why I really wanted to talk about, our childhood. And it was great. I absolutely loved it. And, from my parents' point of view, I'm sure they felt a huge amount of guilt and started questioning what went wrong. And we have this really simplistic way of looking at things, not just as human beings, but particularly as British human beings that like to have this happens, so this happens. It's causation and action. It's like, actually, with depression and suicide, I feel like the more I learn, the less I understand about it. And
I would agree with that, with depression particularly. But
it's just like you keep digging, and the more you try and find a reason, actually, the less grasp you have on actually what's going on at all.
Yeah.
And so particularly with what happened to Sam, we had a very idyllic childhood, and there wasn't. I mean,
it sounded lovely from some of the stories you recount in the book, and just say there's very normal sibling relationships and all those things. Normal, I guess it's like, what is normal?
Exactly.
But like fairly kind of a nice environment to grow up in a nice part of the world and all of that.
Definitely, and so which is obviously positive. But I think when we talk about mental health and we compare it to physical health, what a great way of comparing it is with suicide and depression with cancer. You will never meet anyone that has cancer that's had someone come up to them being like, so how do you get it? Right?
Yeah.
Like,
could you ever imagine asking somebody who had cancer how they got it?
So how do you get your cancer? Right? You don't do that. And obviously you can have triggers that bring on cancer. You can be exposed to high radiation or something, right? But actually, usually it's a combination of genetics, it's a combination of situations, it's a diet, it's all these things. And it's exactly the same with depression, mental illness, and mental health. You don't necessarily need the high radiation exposure to bring on your cancer. You can just develop it. And just roll the wrong number on the dice sometimes. And that's what I tried to get across with Sam. Like, we don't really understand what happened. I can give theories as to what happened, and I can certainly give theories as to why it wasn't, certain things weren't picked up in treatment. But as far as suicides goes, like, I think we need to just take a step back and stop looking at it as it comes from this. And I get asked so many times from people when I'm doing interviews, like, what brought it on, why it happened? And you're like, well, it's just the more you think about why, the less you actually understand about it. And all you've got to know is that to be in that situation, you have to have a deep illness that is that's not being treated properly. So I think that's one of the massive stigmas. And then the second stigma that is just awful is this, that it's seen as a weakness, and there's something weak about suffering depression, or you have to have done something wrong to have ended up in this situation. And I'm like, it's just bizarre. It's absolutely bizarre. I mean, Sam was an incredibly talented person. He was a long way away from weak. He was so strong and dealt with things in such a grown-up adult way for his age. And I've had the pleasure of working with so many people over the last few years that have got very complex diagnosis, that have made attempts on their life throughout their life, that have serious mental illnesses, and without a doubt they're some of the strongest people I've ever met. I mean, I've never had a mental illness, and I've worked in this space for 6 years now. I couldn't imagine being in the depths of sadness and depression that some of these people are in, and being able to actually get out of bed in the morning. Right?
Yeah, I would agree with you. I've got
mad.
some people in my life, and I had my own experiences with depression, and you feel like you're walking through treacle. It's like, I read this somewhere a while ago, a couple of years back, and I was like, that resonated with me. And the people that have had in my life who have had really serious mental illnesses, I am so in awe of their ability to get through the day and to hold down a job and to do all these things with what I know is going on behind the scenes that they are maybe not able to disclose or share. And some of them, unfortunately, still perceive it to be a weakness. I think I had my own issues with that when I was first diagnosed a couple of years ago. But I think that it's so powerful because we would never ever relate the same level of stigma or judgment or assumptions or blame to a physical illness or a physical ailment or issue. And I think it's that disparity which is so problematic that you unpick very, very well in your work. But
and I think what's key to all of this is, unlike physical illnesses, I find when you start talking about mental illnesses that people relate it more to an identity.
Yes.
So if you were to have, I don't know, cancer, or you had Crohn's disease, right? It's not an identity, it's something you live with. When people talk about having schizophrenia, having OCD, having depression, the way we talk about it seems more like a state and an identity, and it's something that you don't live with, you are. Depression is just an illness you live with, in exactly the same way as some people have IBS, right? It's controlled, it's something you live with. It might make, certain moments of your life a little bit more difficult than other people, but it's not an identity. And I think what Sam really struggled with when he was diagnosed, and I guess this is probably because the diagnosis might not have been explained properly to him and he wasn't given the right sort of roadmap of how treatment looks, but he very much felt like he was diagnosed, this was now him, he had this, it was part of him, it was a fixed state, and so no matter what happened in life, he was always just going to be at this level of numbness, right? Because for him, I think actually it wasn't necessarily sadness, it was a numbness, and so emotions just didn't feel the same way to him, and he just had this constant idea that if your mental health was down here, that's what it is for you.
It's
that's
kind of
how your mental health is. When actually, we look at the success stories from treatment, and actually medication can make a huge difference. Talking therapy can make a huge difference, and it can bring you from a sort of low level of health and happiness actually back to a sustainable, happy one. And that's what I try and tell people that are going through it. I'm like, and I've worked with so many people that have gone through this, there will be a day where something will happen and you'll laugh, or you'll feel joy, or you'll see someone and you'll be like, this is great.
And
you
actually enjoy a moment.
Feel that joy again. And I think that's what we need to start saying as well, is like depression, although it can be a very, very long-term thing, it's not an identity, and it doesn't control everything. And there will be, for sure, there'll be a moment at some point where you feel that euphoria of joy again, and it's not that fixed state for the rest of your life.
I think a big part of it is the invisibility of it. I think, like with any chronic conditions, particularly things like ME or chronic fatigue, stuff like that again is, if something is unseen, particularly in Western cultures, we have a real problem with actually recognizing its significance. And I think and I wrote about it in my book about, I kind of trace it back to this, and I've talked about this on the podcast before, so I won't go into too much detail, but to the 17th century and how if we associated ill health with sin, that's kind of very religious moral discourse, then if you're unwell, you're sinful and therefore you're bad. Now, I think we see that in certain health kind of practices, or certainly circulated on social media. We've had some amazing guests on talking about influencer culture and those kind of toxic ideologies that still gets really promoted of unless you're doing all these things and managing your life well, you're not a good person, or you're not a, morally sound person, or proactive or productive enough, or something like that. But there's I would say the same kind of arguments can be applied to mental illness and mental health, whereby if you have a mental illness, or if you have a condition that is unseen, it's so challenging, to communicate that, to kind of actually say this is legitimate, actually authorize it and be like, this is what's happening to me, to be able to communicate that effectively. But also, I think the shame and the guilt is such a archaic, centuries old discourse that is still circulated today, that we still see. Obviously, you're trying to combat it in lots of amazing different ways. And I've had it in my own experiences when I was diagnosed with depression, of having that feeling of, yay, brilliant, right, I've got a diagnosis. Oh, this makes sense. This has been going on for a long time. Now I can be on medication and talking therapy and all these things, but it's nothing to be ashamed of. But today, the shame discourse is still so pervasive. And I just wonder, do you think that what are the kind of worst parts of social media, or the kind of most powerful parts of social media that might exacerbate that in your opinion, particularly for young people? Because I'm very concerned about the mental health of young people, particularly when it comes to mental health issues and how social media can exacerbate some of those. So I'll be interested to get your take on that.
Social media, the big SM. I don't know where to start. There's a lot of talk about, and I was listening to it on the radio on the way here, actually, the chat about, like bringing laws and restricting Facebook and Instagram. And someone mentioned on the radio, they went, imagine if we introduce all these laws under the data, under this Internet Safety Act and all of this, and Facebook and Meta just go, well, this isn't worth our money. It's not worth our time. We're just going to stop operating in the UK. I mean, and it was the first time I'd ever really thought of that. Like suddenly, going onto Instagram, it said, this is not available in your country. Like,
how liberating.
I just sort of started thinking, being like, bring it on.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, what an amazing, that would be the best case scenario for all of these laws, is that Meta just goes, it's not worth our time or our money. We're just going to stop operating in the UK, which would be a massive...
So it's not a choice for anyone. Yeah,
exactly. And I just started thinking, like, the fact that I'm sitting here going, wouldn't that be great, just says everything you need to know. I mean, there is people, often the question around social media is, what are the benefits? What are the negatives? And like, there are brilliant influencers out there. There are brilliant people doing really great stuff on social media. It's driven like a culture around, stuff like this and podcasts and being able to get this in front of people that otherwise we wouldn't be able to do. But I cannot help but think that the positives are so small, dwarfed by the absolute tsunami of negatives that social media, especially for, under 18, under 16-year-olds. So I mean, the worst parts of social media are exactly this. It's the shame, it's the pride, it's a whole ecosystem that's built on prying off the worst parts of people's brains, right? That go, I'm not good enough, so I've got to do this to be better. I'm not social enough, so I've got to be on this to make friends. It's all prying on those little weaknesses
and then the economics
anxieties
of the platform and the structure and design and architecture that then
just
monetizing that and sucking you in and
farms you.
Absolutely. Farming is a good word.
Yeah, because you are. I mean, you're the product, right? You're being sold to advertisers, and so. Yeah, I mean, from every angle, it's bad for children. But I think, what I'm seeing in a lot of the work I do, particularly with social media around body image and eating disorders, for both men and women, muscle dysmorphia, body dysmorphic disorder, just through the roof. I mean, just absolutely through the roof. And from the clinical psychologists I talk to, the ages of these patients just keep getting younger and younger. And now we're not talking about young teenagers. We're talking about children. We're talking about people that are in school learning how to read and write, and then feeling like they have to look a certain way, and using makeup and stuff on filters on phones to make them look better. And they're worried about going for a run and exercising for the wrong reasons. It's that scares me. And none of us are designed to be involved with this social all the time.
Absolutely.
It's draining. It's so draining to be on all the time.
We had Miles Nazaire, who also is co-founder of Playtime Productions, on a few weeks ago talking about muscle dysmorphia, because he was doing a documentary, I think it was with Channel 4, where it was actually just about fitness, and then during the course of recording the documentary, the experts on it diagnosed him with muscle dysmorphia. Wow. He didn't even know he had it until and then obviously once he got the diagnosis, and he then had like this enlightening kind of huge light bulb moment, go, oh my God, like this is, my whole life is kind of framed through the lens of the kind of, we call it like the inverted panoptic gaze in my work. It's like we are increasingly drawn back into that self-surveillance cycle so pervasively. We're continually always looking at ourselves through the lens of the visibility of the audience, the followers we have. But the way in which the social media that we're on and the followers that we have and the communities that we're performing to pull us back into these cycles of visibility and this inverted panoptism, which is so over time damaging. Whether, we can't say that cause necessarily obviously his muscle dysmorphia, but of course it had a contributing factor, and he will admit that. And I think it's this lifestyle comparison stuff and the filters, and it's something we haven't chatted about too much actually on the podcast as yet. Filtering, I think, is incredibly damaging. And I think you see it get reflected in society about the way that, I mean, men, but particularly women as well, when it comes to like fillers and lips, and the way in which we're kind of orchestrating our bodies and molding our bodies to look like influencers, because that's now what's kind of seen as aesthetically pleasing. I mean, I'm aware that you've launched a petition at the moment, haven't you, with the UK government on, I just want to talk about that a little bit, to raise more training, isn't it? Mental health first aid training for teachers in the UK.
Absolutely.
And I guess this also kind of speaks to some of these issues where if our educators have that literacy, as not just the mental health literacy, but also the kind of digital health literacy side of things, then they can better support our young people.
Exactly.
Can you just tell the listeners about that? Because I just think it's a fantastic campaign.
Yeah, absolutely. So Sam died in 2018. I ended up doing a school project, getting people involved in a walk and a fundraiser at the end of the year, which went really well. And actually, it was after that walk, so the end of 2018, I started a petition to train every member of staff in schools in mental health first aid, but actually change the way we were doing it to actually not train qualified teachers, but actually embed it into teacher training, so that everyone that becomes a teacher picks up that training, and then we slowly fill up the sector with people that have that training and that baseline knowledge. That petition did really, really well. 350,000 signatures.
Amazing.
End up in Downing Street. Prime Minister said it was vital, invited me in, photos, all of that. Had the handshakes, and then nothing happened. So we've got a general election coming up this year, and that petition still exists. It's on change.org. But what I really wanted was, from a UK government point of view, a legally binding one, which is the actual government page. Set one up there. I've already got MPs that are willing to back it, because I just think the model at the moment is, and this is a goal that was set by the government, I think in 2019, was to train one mental health lead per school in every country in the UK. And I'm thinking, okay, brilliant. Look, it's a step in the right direction, but you've got a school of 2,500 students in North London or something. And you're really going to say that one mental health
the mental
lead
health of that individual is going to seriously struggle.
Yeah, exactly.
Trying to
They're not going to be logging a
support.
job.
No, that's not feasible or viable for anyone.
To launch any of the amazing projects we're talking about in schools, to add genuine mental health education for every key stage in schools, it requires a baseline knowledge and a foundational knowledge across the sector, which we don't have. At the moment, PSHE, to be a PSHE teacher, you don't have to have any additional qualifications to your subject that you teach. And you're now, so you can have an untrained person, albeit a teacher who's good at teaching, but having an untrained person put into a classroom talking about an issue that they're likely to have. I mean, teachers are one of the worst in terms of stats for mental illness themselves, and they don't really understand mental health. So from my point of view, I've sat through so many PSHE lessons in my time on sex ed, on online safety, and this is nothing against the teachers. They're not given the tools to do this. They were awful lessons. I had someone being hit with a dildo in sex ed, and it was all a laugh and a joke. In online safety, it was just videos and it was all a laugh and a joke and all this
just
stuff.
not taking it seriously.
No one takes it seriously, and I am terrified of, now we've added mental health to the curriculum, that same environment being replicated when talking about depression, anxiety.
It's like a weird other.
If one person laughs in that classroom and it becomes a joke, that someone with depression is never going to forget that.
They're going to
for
feel
the
that
rest of their life. They'll remember what that happened in that room. And I think unless we do this properly, it's actually going to make the problem worse. And the PSHE Association said exactly the same thing in their report. And I think it's not right that we're putting teachers into the position they're in at the moment, with complex social needs, with complex mental health needs, and with the burden of educating on mental health, without giving them a single hour on this. There's absolutely no requirement to know anything about mental health to become a teacher, and that is just completely wrong.
Yeah, well, especially in the mental health crisis that we're living
Yes.
within and through now. And I think COVID has obviously exacerbated that for obvious reasons. And I think the petition is amazing. And my fiance is a teacher and I'm an educator as well. And I think we're so passionate about this because we see the impact of the harms of social media, of the stigma around mental health, lots of things that we've discussed today so far. But the lack of literacy and the training that is just not available. At King's, I've got a role where I focus on the mental health support for our staff and students, and we're really trying to roll out mental health first aid training as much as we can. Again, obviously, there's limited funds because, there's not enough money available, apparently. So you're trying to do all of that and trying to raise awareness because, all of these educators are on the front line of the mental health crisis. If we're thinking about our young people or our young adults, we have to educate them. Those are the people we need to be focusing on right now. And as you say, the educators don't have that training. And I think that it's such a huge disparity and it's so foolish and short-sighted of the government not to have prioritised it, particularly post-COVID. I think I fell into a slight lull maybe with COVID, thinking that as mental health did get a bit of extra focus and funding from the government, that might have extended and continued. But obviously, unfortunately, that hasn't happened.
So I want to and I think with teacher training, they put so much emphasis on being specialists in maths at Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3, Key Stage 4, specialists in maths and English, but none of them actually being taught how could you expect a successful mental health curriculum if the teachers not given a training.
Exactly.
It's so bullshit that they're like, right, make sure let's farm these teachers and they can the students can get this amount of maths and English. I work in special school. At the moment we've got
you see the worst of it.
10 safeguarding students who are self-harming. So I'm needing for this and I'm not trained. I put myself in the different trainings so that I can support my students.
This is what ends up happening.
Based on the government structure or my schools.
Can you hear him?
My school's fine, go and we'll pay for whatever. Go and find it and we'll help you find some. And all of our teachers now and TAs have gone into the training so then we can support our students better. But before that, we're like, oh yeah, let's just do RSC, PHSC curriculum. And none of the teachers are qualified. How could you expect a successful curriculum outcome if that's not been put in place? I think your work's amazing. It's hopefully it will get into.
It has to.
Oh, it would just be amazing, wouldn't it?
It has to. The only way this gets it's in the line of progression. It's just bring it back and going earlier
from the bottom up.
It should have happened when I mentioned it to the government. To be honest,
well,
before COVID, it would have been brilliant. Roll it out then. Start getting teachers in. Makes so much sense.
But they're always looking at cause and effect, and we have to have the data to prove and get blah blah blah, and focus on funding.
It doesn't make sense.
I know, but of course it doesn't, because it's just we're already in a mental health crisis. But if you actually spent time and money investing in that right now, you're going to preempt a huge amount of stuff happening in the future.
Exactly. I do a lot of work with Wagamama, right? So Wagamama runs restaurants, obviously, and for everyone that works in a restaurant, they have to demonstrate that they've been trained to an appropriate level in food safety. And so there is this food safety tool that the Food Standards Agency runs, which is an online course which teaches you everything you need to know online in your own time about food safety. Why on earth can't we produce something similar that every teacher has to go through? We're not talking about in-depth mental health knowledge, but a tool that every teacher has to have gone through.
What is mental health? How might it affect you? How might it not show up? What are the questions to ask? So it could just be basic, basic mental health.
Very basic stuff. And then every teacher training organisation would have to demonstrate that they are appropriately training their staff to an adequate degree. And it could be whatever they want. And then we could have, private people come in and do that if that's an offering that they want to go. But for me, exactly with the Food Standards Agency stuff, you've got this online tool that's great, that works, it's easily accessible, it's in your own time, it's an online tool that everyone can use, and it's up to the restaurant if they use that or not. Because you can find other ways of training your staff, but it's a tool that's there. So why can't that just happen with teachers? It would be such a good first step.
Yeah, absolutely.
Also, the school has to. We get
100%.
We get supervision in group of 4. And EdSite and CAMS. We buy them in for a student. Actually, my head teacher is like, I'm going to buy it in for this stuff because we work in a high intense cases. So with ASC students and mental health, And how could we be successful if we don't have the right support? So not only is great for
100%.
the training, but also for schools to then keep it up and keep it up by providing big funding for schools to be like, right, you get to see a CAN specialist once every 2 weeks, or whether it's 1-to-1, 3-to-1, or in group setting. That's going to be successful in the long term. Whereas like, it's nothing at the moment. It's overall.
What intake for teachers is at record lows. We're set to lose 40,000 teachers in the next 5 years. I mean, you know, unless we invest in teaching and actually give them a job that's worth doing, then it's just going to be. I mean, what happens when education system falls apart because there's not enough teachers?
Yeah.
You know, 6 years ago I was at school, a state school, and you know we had cover teachers all the time. We had teachers off with stress. You know, 1 week you'd have one teacher, next week you'd have someone else because there just weren't enough people going around. It's like the whole thing crumbles. And then, I mean, talk about the economy, because that's what anyone always seems to talk about. Like, training teachers, part of teacher training, makes sense economically because they're already in education, right? You're not taking them out of a job. But also, if education falls apart and we don't have enough teachers, the economy is going to absolutely tank.
Yeah.
We are not going to produce anyone of any caliber that's going to produce any money for the economy. It's just the whole system falls apart.
Yeah,
So
I think that unfortunately
Armageddon is what we're facing if we don't. Yeah, we will. Yeah.
One thing I did want to talk about, actually, because I took part in some suicide first aid training for the first time this year, which was amazing. I mean, hard work. It was, very, very challenging, because also everybody that was in the room was also sharing their own experiences with suicide, ideation, attempts, or family, friends, and so on that they had been aware of, which was obviously, you know, very difficult subject matter, but also incredibly therapeutic as well. It felt like a 3-day therapy session, which was just amazing. And I just wondered whether, have you come across this suicide first aid training much? Because it was something that I was very new to, get in the kind of mental health space, but just interested to get your take on it.
It's sort of ramping up now. There's a few providers that are delivering it, but it's brilliant. It's so brilliant. And I know there's a group called Three Dads Walking that's all about trying to get suicide prevention on the curriculum in schools, and any training we can have in communicating around these difficult issues, the better. And I'd absolutely say that workplaces and stuff should be investing in suicide prevention training in the same way that we've been investing in mental health first aid training. It's so important. Because you just never know. And I think with suicide, it's important to actually understand, you know, the warning signs and stuff like this, and have a few tools in your back pocket that you can bring out, just because you never know when you might need it.
To me, it was communication in terms of like the what to say if you are, or have some kind of suspicion or some kind of gut instinct, whatever it might be, that is telling you that person is not okay. Just the how to go about striking that conversation. And we did a lot of role plays, and it was really full on, but it was just normalizing again, talking about it, and just approaching somebody and saying, are you thinking of ending your life? You know, are you having suicidal thoughts? Are you just saying those words out loud? Because I think we are very uncomfortable with the thought of suicide as a Western kind of culture and society. I think for me growing up, there's an irony in it, but I lost my mum very abruptly at 22. She had a brain aneurysm, but up until that stage in our life, because my mum had a lot of grief, she had really educated us as children, me and my two siblings, on how to talk about grief, because mum she'd lost her sister when she was young. She'd lost a number of very close friends to her. So her big thing was always talk about it. Don't ever not talk about it, and gave us the skill set, which, you know, the kind of mad or whatever wonderful but awful part of it is that she almost prepared us for what then later happened, and then us being able to communicate and talk about our grief of losing her in the end. But I'm so grateful for what she taught us, because I see it so pervasively how uncomfortable it makes people talking about it. And I'd love to know, because I found in the kind of early stages where I was really, I was a mess, obviously. I was, you know, my whole world had been, you know, turned upside down and had imploded. But I found myself getting really pissed off with people, the way that they were talking to me. Like, really, obviously the anger was a part of the grief process, fine. But and I just wonder, for you with your grief, and is there anything you can kind of share with, what's a good way to go about talking with grief with people, and how do you manage your grief as well?
Oh, Grief is
questions.
grief's like a fingerprint. Everyone's is different, honestly. The more I talk to people about it, the more I realize how individual it is. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's so difficult to talk about it, is because you never quite know, do they want to talk about it? Do they not want to talk about it? Are they angry at the what? You know, it's just a complete minefield to have the conversation about. I think I guess it's for the individual to sort of work out how they're going to best look after themselves and deal with it, and when they're in a good mood. I'd say exactly what your mum said. Like, you can't just, as long as you're not ignoring it and pushing it away and filling it with we're filling that space that you have with stuff. If you're constantly trying to do stuff and avoid thinking, then that's. I read a study the other day that saw that looked at people's willingness to feel things, right, and to feel emotions, and they offered this study the opportunity to sit with their thoughts in silence for 5 minutes or receive an electric shock. And I'm going to make this up because I can't remember exact numbers, but it was more than half said electric shock over 5 minutes in silence. I think it says so much about the way we deal with bad things. The way we usually deal with bad things, especially in Britain, is actually throwing ourselves into work or parching or filling those
exercise
and
or
trying to avoid the silence. And
sorry, can we just go back to that study quickly? So sorry, this was just to sit with their thoughts, not to sit with a negative thought. This is just sitting
like here. Everyone
just
quiet,
sitting in silence
5 minutes.
For 5 minutes and have to grapple
Would
with
you
your
rather
own mind.
Sit on with your thoughts alone and silence 5 minutes, or take an electric shock?
And more people went for the electric shock.
More people had electric shock.
Oh, and that's really sad.
But it was such a good way of saying of really getting into this issue that we have. Is like we're so scared of silence, and we're so scared of actually understanding what's going on. And people ask me all the time, like, what's the best thing we can do for our mental health? That's it. Is sitting in silence 5 minutes and understanding what's going on. Your mind is it's like the M25 at 5 p.m, right? It's just going around. There's everything going around it. And if we just sort of forget about it and do things to stop it, it's just spinning and spinning and spinning. What we really need is to take that time to just sit there and work out in your mind, like, what's actually going around. What's that? Oh, that's a HGV, that's a red car. And like, just think about the thoughts that are going through. That's by a long way the best thing that happened to me, and the best thing I've learned is how to actually check in and think. And then in terms of grief, and this is going to sound so abstract, and I hate that I'm going to say this, but I'm going to have to say it because it's my favorite analogy. You have to treat grief as a bit like a pet that you've been given. So it's like, imagine if you have a relative or whatever, whoever's died has actually left you this pet, okay? And say it's a dog, and it's an untrained, aggressive dog that's every time you go near it, it's going to bite you. If you every morning come down to that dog and you start shouting at it and shutting it in a room and ignoring it and neglecting it, the dog is not going to get better.
It's going to get angry.
It's going to get angry. It's going to bite you. It's going to be an unpleasant animal to be around. If you start to slowly show it respect and give it space and offer it yourself and give it time and give it attention and care for it and be nice to it and don't get angry when it snaps, but actually look after it and be nice to it, then eventually it's going to start trusting you, and it will start working with you, and it will get to a point where you can live with it. And people talk about grief a lot and they say, it doesn't ever go away, but you get used to it. Well, that's exactly it. It's this pet you've been given, and if you can treat it in the right way, there's no reason why you can't live a very happy life with this friend.
That is a fantastic way, and that resonates with me.
Okay, good.
Very much. But that is a fantastic way to explain the living with it bit, because I think that it is that, and you cannot ignore, and you have to acknowledge, and you have to learn to. The best bit of advice I ever got was, it was just after Mum had died, and my granddad had said, actually, he was like, he just pulled me aside, and it obviously everything was a fog in that moment, but I do remember very distinctly him saying, "You'll never get over this moment, but you will learn to live with it." And it did give me a glimmer of like, okay, right, I'll take that on board, and like, let's almost like a practical, like, right, I'll learn to live with this. And some days it's harder and some days it's easier, but I think that is a really great way of thinking about the living with, the acknowledging the impacts that dog, that thing in your mind is going to have on your everyday. And sometimes it's going to be louder and quieter, and it's always there. And I think if you don't acknowledge when it's loud or when it's quiet at all, it's going to take over other things in your life and ultimately make you unwell mentally or physically in some way.
And you've got to be kind to it. Like so many people I speak to, and even myself, and this is something I try and work on so much, is actually like being kind to the negative emotions and thoughts. So grief, for example, great one. If you start getting annoyed at your grief and getting annoyed at all of this, it's just going to get worse and it's going to become a battle. The biggest one I found is with anxiety, and I sort of talk about my experience with this in the book, but through the sort of trauma and grief, and I was at uni, like I started getting these feelings of anxiety and to a point where it would like stop me from doing certain things. And I remember I'd just get so angry at myself. I'd be like, that is so pathetic, Ben, like you can't do that, like you're that nervous about doing this that you're not going to do it, and you're going to sit here and you're going to feel bad about yourself. And I would just beat myself up at it. And then I was talking to my counselor, and we sort of went through it, and she was just like, of course you're going to feel bad because you're just attacking this feeling. And what you really need to do is to understand it is anxiety, in my case, anxiety, trauma, the trauma response, an element of grief. These are parts of your brain and sort of mechanisms in your brain that are trying to keep you safe, and their only job is to protect you.
Very true.
Right?
Very true.
And so if we're getting angry at it, all we're doing is frustrating and irritating these mechanisms. And what we really need to do with anxiety is welcome it, go, thanks so much for keeping me safe, but actually everything's okay. And like we are okay at the moment, but I appreciate the heads up.
Yeah.
And I've started doing that, and you can start to really allow yourself to just calmly rationalize the situation.
I guess with that, you are retraining your neural pathways, I think, to think about it from that kind of neuroscience perspective. That is, as you say, like the acknowledgement is the first most important thing. Acknowledge its presence, that its utility is there for a very valid reason, and then also be like, okay, that's enough. I've had enough of you now. You can leave.
But thank you.
Thanks
for the warning.
Thanks for the heads up.
Alarm. Yeah, and it's so important because I think so much of what we talk to, I mean, if we had a little speaker on our back and people could listen to what we were saying, I think we'd be so embarrassed by how we talk to ourselves. It's shocking how awful we can be to ourselves. And you're like, no wonder we have record low self-esteem generally. Like the voice that we have internally is just so awful. And I think if we can work on anything, and it'd be quite not an easy fix, but something simple to work on, it should be just catching ourselves out when we're doing that and realizing, like starting to rework how we think about these things, and change our relationship with bad feelings. And eventually that's sort of like a house of cards, because you start doing that and suddenly the shame goes. Everything
the
else
habits
goes.
are changing and the pathways are changing in your brain. And so it's like a ripple effect.
Absolutely. Which got to be kinder. And kinder to the bad emotions. They're not bad. There's no such thing as a bad emotion, really.
No, they're just
emotions for a different reason.
Yeah.
And that's
More
my
helpful,
frustration.
less helpful.
Yeah, it's my frustration with anxiety, is I think it's become like a sort of a term that's bounded around a lot. And it's got the weight of the illness. And obviously there's anxiety disorder,
I think,
right? Of course, there's anxiety disorder, but anxiety is a really normal thing.
Yeah.
Like anxiety is great. We love anxiety. It's a good thing. It's a good part of the human, emotion range. It's the only problem comes when people have anxiety disorders, right? And I just think we need to sort of just keep ourselves in check with how we're referring to things like this.
But I think this also comes to the kind of mental health awareness and training and talking about it that we need to increasingly normalize. And I see this with my students a lot, obviously at King's, whereby there's a lot of anxiety being spoken about, being experienced, and it's never to diminish it, but we do try and explain to the students it's very normal to get anxious around assessment periods. It's very normal to get anxious when you're preparing for a presentation or whatever, these types of things. Anxiety disorder or prolonged anxiety that actually prevents you from living your life as you would have done if that wasn't quite so pervasive in dictating what you're up to day to day, that is different. But I think this comes down to a level of literacy and understanding where the mental health is bad, so it's all these things are bad, so we'll just chuck it all in one big box over there, and like either we won't deal with it or we won't fully understand how to deal with it. And I think this really kind of comes to the core of obviously what all the work that you're doing. Can we just come back to a point you made about sitting with your thoughts and feelings? I mean, obviously, from my perspective, technology has a lot to answer for in that. area, because I think one of the biggest issues with social media and scrolling and is the distraction from what's happening internally. How do you manage your relationship with technology out of interest? Because you have a presence and obviously you use it for so much good, but at the same time you have to navigate your relationship with that as well.
Yeah, it's been a process, and I haven't always got it right. And I still probably don't have it completely right. I've tried to. I honestly I went on this digital retreat once, and that sounds really hippie. It wasn't. It was just a cabin in the woods.
They're quite common now, though.
They're great. Yeah, I really loved it. And me and my girlfriend went, and I locked my phone in a box, and I had two or 3 days without my phone, and it's never. I honestly never used my phone the same way since.
Wow. Okay. It's proper reset. For you.
Genuinely. And I just saw it. I suddenly had this moment where I was like, I mean, I didn't quite go this far, but I came out and I was like, I'm going to buy myself a Nokia brick. I don't need a phone. I can do everything on text, right? And all this. I didn't do that. But that was sort of where I came. And so now my phone is a work tool, and I use it for work. And I very rarely will put anything personal on my Instagram. I'll very rarely talk about anything personal because that's not what it's there for me. I text my friends. I keep it in certain locations so it's not on Instagram. And the big one for me, which was a really important step that I think everyone should do, is if you're using Instagram for work or these things for work, which a lot of us are, then don't work weekends. So don't go on social media on weekends. And I haven't posted anything or been on, well, maybe dipped in and out, but haven't really been on Instagram or social media at weekends for about 1.5 years. And it's great because I have that boundary, and that boundary's become a habit.
Yeah.
So it feels really weird.
It feels normal now.
Yes.
It didn't at the beginning, obviously.
So, like, and especially when we're talking about like influencers, there's this constant thing of like, we've got to have something up, Well, I've just normalized the fact that actually, if I don't have anything to say, I'm just not going to say it. Like, I don't really care.
I don't need to have a filler photo.
Yeah, I don't need to post anything on a Saturday or a Sunday. That's my time. I don't care. And I think that's a really good boundary that everyone can do. Just monitor how you're using it. And again, like, it's entertainment. In the same way that you wouldn't have 5 minutes on the bus and put Netflix on your phone. Maybe we do. I don't know. You don't have to fill up every single crack of your day with social media and flicking. Because we know in the same way, I mean, and you'll know more about this than I do, but I was in Las Vegas recently. Didn't enjoy.
Didn't enjoy. Las Vegas is a
bizarre place. Absolutely
very
bizarre.
Plastic.
Oh, it's some people love it. I couldn't wait to get out.
Not for me.
No. And you're walking around, and you know what? The only thing I've ever seen my social media feed look like is a slot machine. It's exactly the same.
Yeah.
It's the scrolling, moving things, and it's that unpredictability of what's about to come up next. And I looked into it, and it's that the social media app and the interface itself has been designed with exactly the same psychologically addictive things, and this the unexpected, I don't know what the actual word is for it in psychology terms, but it's like that reward sensation of I don't know what the next thing's going to be. It's the same stuff. So in the same way that if you had 5 minutes on the bus, you wouldn't go and log into I don't know, whatever. I don't know what these apps are called, like poker.com, right? And start doing gambling or do slot machines.
Well, but I think people do.
And if you do that, then you'd probably start to realize, I've probably got an unhealthy relationship with gambling, right? And there's a huge advertising campaigns about, gamble, but safely and all of this. The apps are the same thing. They're playing on the same thing. Maybe they're not costing you money. Maybe they are. But we just have to have those boundaries in and just keep yourself in check in a nice way.
What do you think the tech companies should be doing?
Apart from giving up with the UK and leaving and just moving their business somewhere else. I think they look at what Brianna's guy's mum's talking about at the moment, restricting it under 16s. There's absolutely no reason why an under 16-year-old should have an Instagram account or TikTok account.
Or a phone. I mean, I'm not
or
a parent,
phone.
But it's...
But the only way that's going to change is if everyone does. Because I found that my parents didn't let me have Facebook until I was far older than everyone else was. So everyone at school had this app and I didn't. And you in your heart, you feel like you're not part of the clique and the gang.
FOMO,
and I had a friend at school that didn't have social media, and we'd go and do things and we'd get there and be like, we haven't told him. And it wasn't because we didn't want him
Yeah.
involved. It just he wasn't on the group chat that we were on this one app. And so I think that what needs to happen is for it to be like, let's ban it from this age so no one has it. So there's no peer pressure to have it. And then people can actually just get about their normal life. But I would say, you know, and going further than this, like there is absolutely no reason if they can flag every single post for 3 years that mentioned anything about a vaccine on Instagram and labeled it with
This
something.
is it, right?
This
is
no
what makes
reason.
me very, very cross in
We've
terms of
seen them flex
misinformation.
their muscle
Yeah,
of how much they
We've
can
seen
do.
it does work, and
It
you
works.
can do it like
they
that.
know exactly how to do it.
Yeah.
There is a reason that they're not, and I think a large part of that is admitting that there is a problem that they can fix. It's just it would be so easy for them tomorrow to launch this put a new different thing into their algorithm that labeled all the vaccine stuff during lockdown and stopped any posts around, you know, the simple one, for instance, the absolutely simple one that could be tackled tomorrow, how-to videos on suicide and how to, if you're struggling, this is how you do it.
Yeah.
You Google it and it will come up, right? And you'll get the banner saying, you know, these are some numbers you can call, but there'll be people are producing that content and you're just like, that is such an easy one. And we know suicide prevention training, in my job, we talk about suicide, and talking about suicide is never going to make someone want to take their own life, right? Talking about how you take your life and methods, that's been proved to actually do the opposite and will make people.
Absolutely.
And so there's no reason why tomorrow Instagram, TikTok, Facebook can just say anything that goes on against that, we will get rid of immediately as it's put up, and not go through some review period. And as we've all know, because they'll throw the community guidelines card at everyone and go, we review all content. Well, get it off immediately and labeled. There's no reason why we can't do that. And same with Google. I mean, because, you know, it's the accessibility of this stuff's shocking. And then with harmful content as well, there's progress, but it's just not good enough. And, you know, under 16s, children, even if the algorithm behind this is watertight or as close to watertight as it can be, and there's the chance of harmful content is low, why are we taking the risk with children? And, you know, we've basically let, as with a number of industries in this country, in this world that we grew up in, we've let this industry just self-regulate for its entire existence, and no one's now powerful enough to really regulate it. Ofcom aren't. And it's just, we just need a big law to come in, give Ofcom power, give Ofcom funding, and take this on, because these people are running circles around us. I mean, Meta could own countries. They've got such high net worth.
I mean, they know it's happening. We've had, in earlier episodes, we've spoken about this, all those leaked documents where they had found internally that there was reporting on that there was a correlation, particularly for young women, teenagers, and children looking at content on Instagram and feeling bad about themselves, exacerbating eating disorders in particular. That really went through the roof during the pandemic. We've got another guest coming on in a later episode who's a digital marketeer who's worked through the kind of iteration and growth of digital marketing and how much content. So if a brand, for example, gets aligned with any kind of harmful content, they might disassociate from that content, or kind of, you know, if it happens kind of accidentally through algorithmic whatever, but the content still exists, and that's the problem. And I think it's money, right? I guess that content still gets attention, it still gets clicks, it still gets likes, and therefore we're driving harmful content just because it's making somebody, mainly a tech giant, money. And in what world can that ever be ethically okay? I mean, how can they live with themselves?
I don't understand. You know what? I was in my car on the way here as well, and this is a completely separate to social media, but it's sort of the same point about, you know, our responsibility to children. It was an advert for McDonald's, and it went, "It's half term." Da, 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 da. And it was basically that, and it was just like, kids, you're on holiday, have a McDonald's. I'm like, it's just awful. How can we have a conversation about child health and child obesity and diabetes in children, and then allow McDonald's to advertise directly
they're not allowed
to children?
to advertise to children.
It's half term. I must have been to parents then.
Right, I was going to say, because it's now illegal, but obviously they've
it's
fined
half
$1 million.
term.
Yeah.
And then the McDonald's,
Well, the
mayo
ASA
chicken
need to
for
get
£1.
on that advert, because that is.
But it's and you're just like, it's just completely bizarre. And then they're sponsoring sport teams, but it's the same. It's like we have with this. I'm lucky that I work for the few businesses that you feel that corporate social responsibility. So many don't. So many just say the right words and get through
it's
it.
virtue signaling. Just
Virtue
like a little
signaling
bit
with
of,
social media, there's been so much of that.
Yeah.
I just think there's like, I was listening to it, I'll repeat that again, I was listening to it and they said there's a chance that they'll just, Meta and all these and TikTok will just look at this legislation and go, it's not worth our time or money, and we'll just, you know, take our business out. And I just think it would be chaos
Yeah.
for about 6 months, but we'd find a way through it.
Yeah.
And actually it would be a real opportunity to legislate properly and regulate properly and allow some social media developers to come back in, but heavily regulate their product and work out actually what is it that people want. I think it'd be a great opportunity.
Yeah.
So
Well, we don't know what we want because we're just being fed everything all the time. So I think this is a big part of the distraction, and particularly I think this is also what exacerbates mental health issues. Is filling our time, filling the void, filling the, you know, the constant digital noise that is seeping into so much part of. I mean, it's why I started this podcast, is to try and raise awareness of what's going on, and also just to try and understand how we can live better with it.
Isn't it interesting though, by the way, just on this, if the thought of losing Instagram tomorrow is scary, right? Isn't that so
It's so
interesting?
bizarre.
We know it's bad for us, but there's a deep rooted thing in my brain that goes, what would I do? That'd be awful. Oh, what would I do? Like I even feel that I talk about this all the time, and I feel like I'd be missing out if it got away. It's just bizarre.
But you've got
it's a bit like ice cream, right?
But you've
You know
got
it's
arguably
bad.
a very healthy relationship with it compared to many people who are on their phones
But I'd still
hours
miss
and hours
it.
and hours a day, doom scrolling. I've been guilty of it. It's something that I have to very consciously and actively be very aware of. And I think, but because the platforms are so brilliant at pulling us in, it's very challenging. And also, if you are somebody that is suffering with mental health illnesses or anxiety, you know, trying to distract yourself from your own internal narrative that's really continually giving yourself a hard time, it's almost impossible. We're nearly getting towards the end, but there's a couple of key things that I do want to ask you and I would love your insight on. The first one is about what we can do as a society, and it's a huge question, to protect children and young adults' mental health. I'd love to hear your insights on that.
I mean, there's sort of two ways of looking at society. I guess as a whole, it's educating ourselves, having open conversations with people, you know, asking the difficult questions, you know, being there for people, talking about things. My big thing with all this is there's been a lot of onus and a focus on talking recently over the last 5, 6, 10 years. You need to talk. Let's talk about mental health. I think what's been missed out of that is actually the most important people that should be talking are not necessarily the people that are struggling, it's everyone else around. So 1 in 4 people have a mental health condition. It should be the 3 in 4 that are talking and being vulnerable and open, and then the 1 in 4 are going to naturally open up anyway.
Open up. That's
right?
A very good
so
point.
I think, and that's what I try and do with my job. I don't particularly struggle a lot. I struggle sometimes, but I try in my friend group to be quite honest about, like, I've had a really bad week. This is all going on and this is what I'm struggling with. And if you can offer that, you'll be so shocked at what you get back from people. And so I think we just need to make those changes society-wide. But then from a government level, we need to be putting so much more attention and care and funding into social care, into the NHS for CAMHS. I mean, the funding level of CAMHS is just astonishingly low. You know, government's own reports will say that the waiting list is too long now for it to be sustainable. The average spend in an NHS trust of the overall mental health budget, so what's allocated to adult and children, the average is 7.2% spent on children. In the lowest trust, it's less than 2% of the overall budget is spent on children. And the adult mental health service is stretched. You know, so imagine what 2% of that budget's going to do. You know, children are waiting 2 years now for treatment, or up to 2 years. It's just, that's not sustainable. And then for, you know, just again, it's about education and getting schools into a healthy position. Because right now, schools are not healthy. They're not. The education in this country is not a healthy sector, and it should be. It should be thriving. It should be the one thing that we can get right. And it's just not. And that I think's a real shame. So it's just, I mean, it's all about, it comes down to money and investment. But but being careful and intelligent in where we're spending the money. Teacher training, for example, don't spend it on expensive courses for teachers that are already in a job. Embed it into your already existing training program. It's so much more economically efficient, and actually it will start making money.
The ripple effects of that
it will improve the economy.
I guess the problem is, and I guess this is a very way, I don't know, I guess the way that the Tories look at politics, but it's like it's not preventative. And if you put it into teacher training, the preventative measures and ways that, you know, I mean,
because it's not, you can't sit on a spreadsheet and
you can't quantify it.
Bam.
It's so you haven't got the data to kind of evidence it, and therefore you can't be like, right, well, it's going to impact society for the better in this way and going to alleviate all these kind of stresses and strains on the NHS, say, for example, or mental health wait lists. But it's the preventative stuff that needs to happen, right? And I think it's a really great point about the everyday person who maybe isn't experiencing mental health kind of crises or, you know, specific illnesses, talking about it and normalizing. And one thing I always say to my clients, to my students, to myself, is everyone has mental health. Like, we all kind of exist in a space where we've all got it. It's just sometimes it's more kind of prominent, and maybe it's a more difficult day, and some days it's easier and lighter in your mind. But we've all got it. It all exists within us. It's just the same as our physical health. And I think it's really important to recognize that. Before we finish up, we always ask our guests to share like a top tip, like one key takeaway that they can take away to just have a better relationship with their mental health. Something that you can share would be really valuable.
Oh, it's always difficult coming up with the one top tip. So my top tip would be, and this is my New Year's resolution for the year, is walk every day. And it's been what I've been trying to do every day. And it's taking out the earplugs, it's putting your phone in your pocket. It's not walking to just get to a destination. It's walking and trying to notice, it's mindfulness really, trying to notice, like, I don't know, the plant growing out the wall, or, you know, the squirrel running up a tree, and understand, like, just taking a moment to actually watch life. And I think life becomes really overwhelming until you step back and just watch it go around you, and watch the birds flying around, and the butterflies in spring that we're almost in, and the flowers and all of this. That suddenly you'll step out and do that and watch things happen, and you just come back with this lighter feeling of like, this is actually quite simple. So I'd say that's really important, and take that moment as well to do what we said earlier, which is just don't electric shock yourself. Have 5 minutes alone with your thoughts.
Just be with yourself
and understand what's going around your M25.
I love that. That's so great. My tip is to be vulnerable, because it's a word that I think we're becoming less afraid of, but I think it sits uneasy with a lot of us when we use the words vulnerability. And I think it's been framed in a very dystopian or negative way, but I think vulnerability can be an absolute superpower in terms of the accessibility and transparency that it can enable in relationships, friendships, colleagues, you know, with your professional relationships. If you're vulnerable, if you're honest and transparent about what's going on within your capacity and within what feels appropriate and comfortable for you, I think that can be so incredible to foster and build stronger connections with people. And I think just sharing what's going on, because I think it's the not sharing, isn't it, right, that isolates us further. And I think that's where social media and tech can really exacerbate those disparities, or the feeling that everybody else's life is easier or better and more straightforward. Ben, what comes next for you before we finish up? What's going on?
What comes next? That's a really good question. So obviously we've got the petition. Hopefully that goes, you know, we've got general election coming up soon. I know I've got events where I'm talking to MPs soon, grilling them or supporting them, trying to get, you know, headway with the teacher training stuff. Again, I just think it's so central to everything else, and I fail to see what hasn't been done.
We'll share the links on everything.
Amazing. But I just think it doesn't make sense. It hasn't happened. So that I'll be walking, doing my thing.
Nice.
So training teachers, hopefully.
Yeah, great. Oh, well, congratulations.
Thank you.
On everything. And this book is amazing. I absolutely loved it. I said to my partner, like, it resonated with me in a way that I haven't felt with a book on like grief, and particularly, and kind of mental health before.
Thank you.
So yeah, congratulations.
Thanks so much. It's so strange to see it in real life. Hey, I haven't seen you for a while. Oh, thank you.
Sit there and hold it.
I really appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Digital Health Diagnosed, your dose of tech wellbeing. We're here every episode to give you tips and strategies to have a better relationship with your technology and your mental health. Please remember to like, follow and subscribe across all the usual channels. We'll see you next time.